If I fix your bike, can you keep me? Brian's voice was small against the hiss of rain on corrugated metal, but it folded into the garage like a challenge. He held out a photograph with fingers stained dark as the oil that had seeped into the hems of his jacket. The picture was sun-faded, a younger James Carver with a grin crooked around a cigarette, arms slung over the seat of a battered Harley. On the back, in his grandfather's blocky handwriting, were 3 words, unfinished, like a promise. Finish what we started. Thunder Forks looked closed. The big door was down, the sign's neon half-burned, one bulb dim. A chain rattled as Rex, who ran the place and kept more rules than hours in a day, came to the gate. Rex was all knuckles and quiet, the kind of man who made the garage feel like a statement and not a business. He took the photo, squinted, then looked at the boy. "You're not old enough to sign for parts," Rex said. He had the voice of someone who'd learned to keep strangers from writing checks with his patients. "You got any ID?" Brian's pockets had nothing of use, except a small leather roll of tools and the photograph, folded and worn along the edges. The roll was his grandfather's. He kept the tools safe because in them lived the only proof he had of belonging, a 10mm wrench with a notch filed in the handle, a Phillips that had seen better screws. He was 15. He had no one else. "My granddad, James Carver, he said Thunder Forks once kept him when he was out on his feet. Brian stopped. The words thinned against the rope of his throat. "He's in the VA, had a stroke. I'm supposed to go into care, but he shoved the roll of tools forward. If I make that bike run, your old 47 shovelhead that's been sitting since '98, if I get it running in 48 hours, will you keep me? Let me stay, at least until the social people sort it? I can work. I know bikes." Rex let the silence stretch. Crow and Diesel, 2 mechanics who could be counted on to show up just to curse at parts, hovered with smudged cheeks and cigarettes tucked behind their ears. Butcher, older than all of them, smelled like spent coffee and the tang of metal filings. He leaned on a bench, watching the boy not with suspicion, but with a measured tilt, as if calculating horsepower from a glance. 48, Rex said finally. "You got 48 hours. You want to sleep in the back, you prove by sunrise you're worth the bench." He tapped the photo. "If this is your kin, there's paperwork, no promises. You get 1 shot, you get supervised hours. You break the rules, you get taken to a shelter. Understand?" Brian nodded. The word understand landed heavier than anything he'd carried. Inside his chest, the clock started. 2 days that might change everything. Rex handed him a rag and pointed to the shovelhead under a dust sheet, a machine of ghosts and rust. "We ain't giving out favors round here," Rex said. "You earn it."
If stories like this matter to you, give it a thumbs up. He started like a man who could feel the metal's bones. The first hour was small rituals. He wiped a spark plug with his sleeve, traced the frame numbers, eased the carburetor bowl free, and flipped through it as if reading the margins of an old letter. Each motion was a sentence in a language he'd learned from his grandfather, hands telling what mouth couldn't. Butcher watched and, when Brian asked, leaned over the engine with the kindness of an older teacher who'd chosen to keep speaking. "Carver kid, grandfather's hands in yours," Butcher said without sentiment. "You keep them clean, and they'll tell you what to do. You mess them up, they'll tell you quicker." Brian found a small slot behind the battery box, a place where the metal hugged itself and hid secrets. He cleared the grime with a screwdriver tip and found a small leather pouch that wasn't part of the original build. Inside were pictures and a folded note, brittle with years. There were photos of a younger James, his arm thrown around a man named Rex in the very garage where Brian stood. There were shots of late-night grease-stained faces, a woman with a baby at her hip, a handoff of an American flag. The last photograph was of James next to the shovelhead, a look half-lay between apology and resolve on his face. That was when the whole machine stopped feeling like a promise to a stranger and started being a ledger for a life. Brian read the note. It said, in a hand steady even with age, "Finish this for me. Finish us." They set rules. Brian would work daylight and late shift, but sleep would be in a cot outside the main day initially. He was not to take anything off-site, not to ride alone, not to get near the keys until Rex said so. For every hour of wrench time, there would be an hour of supervision, a phone call on file. Millie would be involved. Millie arrived like a practical correction to the romanticized garage lore. She'd been James Carver's daughter, practical, efficient, legal-minded, though all grown up into someone who worked for Child and Family Services. Her presence complicated things, in the way anything honest complicates a good story. She could turn a heartfelt decision into a stack of forms. She recognized Brian from hospital paperwork and from the faded handwriting in the photos. She folded her arms and read the pile of conditions Rex had set down. "I can file for emergency kinship placement," she said, "but it has to be demonstrated the club can provide a stable environment. That's not just sleeping on a cot, Rex. There's health, schooling, supervision." "We ain't pretending," Rex interrupted. "We'll do the work. He fixes the bike, he earns a place to sleep under our roof. That gives you time to file." "You understand this isn't a guarantee," Millie said to Brian. "I have to make sure you're safe and that this is in your best interest."
"That could mean you stay at Thunder Forks while I process the emergency paperwork. It could mean I bring you into temporary care. You must know there are no certainties." Brian did know. There was no lying to the look in Millie's eyes. He also knew what he had: his grandfather's tools, a photograph, and 2 days. He nodded. "I'll earn it," he said. He felt every inch of that word like a measure. The first half of the race was a study in small victories and the building of a rhythm. Wrenching, cleaning, cataloging parts, wiring harnesses, cleaning carburetor jets until they shone. No dramatic reveals, but the payoff of parts that belonged back together. Diesel handed Brian a straight edge to check the cam chain tension, and Crow kept time on the stopwatch, muttering at the coffee that never cooled. Night smelled of motor oil and cigarette smoke and coffee. Hands learned to read the subtleties, a hairline crack on a gasket, the way a worn bearing would sing before seizing. During one late stretch, under a light that hummed too loudly, Brian sat on a grease-streaked crate and let his mind drift to the VA. He remembered James's hands, calloused, patient, running along the same bolts. He remembered a lesson told in half sentences, the way elders speak where instructions are folded into stories. If it sticks, it's probably been stuck since before you were born. Find the stubbornness and you find the reason. Brian chewed his lower lip and reached for the next stubborn bolt. 2/3 through the allotted time, while the team had been pulling the primary and inspecting the timing, Butcher leaned over, his forehead furrowed. The bike had been misfiring. Compression was decent, the plugs sparking, the carbs feeding, but the engine would cough and die at the slightest provocation. They'd rebuilt the top end, set valve clearances, adjusted floats. Everything seemed plausible. Then Brian found the marks. Rex had asked him to place the timing marks on the primary chain once he had everything back to the block. Brian, trusting a worn indicator and the dim light and the fatigue behind his eyes, aligned the marks and bolted the cover back on. In the morning trial start, the engine fought and choked. The rhythm was wrong. The valves seemed to be out of sync. Butcher ran his hand along the cam cover, felt a faint misalignment, then squinted at the marks. "You lined it up half a turn off," he said. "You're at 180 degrees. Brian's stomach went hollow. He replayed the sequence in his head. One small mistake with massive echo. Timing marks being 180 degrees off meant the valve train could be opening at the wrong phase, the ignition firing when the piston was on the wrong stroke. It could mean bent valves, dented pistons, a ruin of the very thing they were trying to revive. "I checked it," Brian said. He wasn't trying to argue, he was trying to find where the error started. But the error had weight. The rest of the shop felt it like a bad clatter. It was the kind of mistake that could kill the whole 48-hour shot. "You fix it," Rex said, voice flat. "We fix it together. You don't walk, kid. None of us do." He wasn't saying he forgave the mistake. He was saying they'd see it through, together. So they pulled the head again. Sparks of frustration were audible in the clank of sockets. Butcher worked with a kind of tired gentleness, guiding Brian's hands. "Timing's not a punishment, it's a conversation," he said. "You listen. If you don't, she kicks back." He was showing Brian how to rotate the crank while watching the cam lobes, how to feel the slack in the chain, how to set the marks to top dead center on the compression stroke, and then double-check before bolting. He explained what a 180-degree error did without lecturing. It tells the valves to open when the piston's supposed to be finishing, not starting. You get hungry for parts if you let it run that way. It took time to fix what ached. They checked for damage. Valves bent? Not on this one. Luck, old tolerances, and the fact that James had always been stubborn in parts. Still, the error meant checks on shims and clearances and a fresh torque on every head bolt. Hands moved with a new intent. Crow and Diesel handed parts and kept the coffee coming. Millie, in the meantime, was filling out forms with a practical rigor that could have been indifferent if it weren't for the way her jaw tightened when she read Brian's name. She spent afternoons on the phone with the regional office, explaining the scenario without sentiment but with enough detail to meet the bureaucracy's appetite for facts. The rebuilding pushed them back on schedule. The 48-hour clock tightened. Fewer hours to nap, more hours awake. Brian felt the weight of each turn of the socket like a measure of possibility. He slept poorly, if at all. His hands cramped and the cuticle split. He coughed and his voice turned throat deep. But he kept showing up to the bench. In the small hours, after Rex had said his piece and stepped away, Brian picked up a photo and slid his thumb over a crease. In one of the shots, James had written something on the back. "If you find this, you fix it for us." It read like a dare. Brian learned that some things are less about the object and more about the obligation. The bike had been a vessel of apology, a way for James to try to stitch together missed chances. To put the engine on the road was to answer a call he hadn't been able to finish. They moved into a montage that condensed the next hours into rhythms. Daylight shifting, clouds thinning, hands blackening, coffee cups stacking, a lamp set on a swivel. There were moments that felt small, a joke passed about a stubborn nut, a cigarette stubbed in a can, a bandage wrapped too roughly around a fingertip, and moments that felt vast, a crowd of men leaning against the wall, watching Brian like a team that had bet on a rookie.
Butcher taught him how to set the carburetor floats, to recognize a lean mixture by the way the engine inhaled, not by a gauge. Millie came in, pushed a stack of papers toward Rex, and asked quietly if the place met the basics: first aid kit, locks on the doors, a plan for schooling. Rex scribbled an outline of proposed supervision and a list of club members who could be references. When the second crisis happened, it was not mechanical. It was fatigue and fear and the law making its presence known. A representative from the courthouse called. There were forms Brian would have to sign. An inquiry from a neighbor about the child sleeping in the parking lot. Someone will always be watching, it turns out. The social worker sent instructions. Emergency kinship required demonstration of stability. Millie filed what she could, but the timelines were narrow and the scrutiny heavy. She spoke plainly to Brian. They'll look at the place, the people, your schooling, your ties. They can grant a temporary placement while they investigate, but it's not a promise. You have to show them, not tell them. You do these things with honesty, Butcher said later, pulling Brian aside. This work, it's honest. It shows you're steady. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be steady. At dawn on the second day, they had crawled close enough to trying that the whole garage felt like holding its breath. Rex handed Brian a rag and a new set of spark plugs. "We do a start attempt at 9, he said. "You do the honors." They pulled the exhaust and checked the compression one more time. Everything looked as it should. The timing marks aligned with the crank at top dead center. The carburetor was jetted to a setting Butcher recommended for old-school, low-octane fuel. The battery was charged and the ignition points were gapped. Millie, who had been pacing the administrative space of the garage, clutched a clipboard with the latest submissions. She had delivered a shout-out to whatever heart of paperwork kept the file moving. The clerk on the line admitted provisional inspection that afternoon. The hearings were pending. The most they could do, Rex, Millie, Butcher, and the club, was create a record that this place could be a temporary home. Brian pulled the kick lever. The engine cranked and coughed. Cough, cough. A shudder that sounded like the bike was trying to remember itself. The second kick, the engine caught but died. The third, it popped and hiccuped, spitting out a cloud of black smoke that tasted like victory and panic. "Give it to him clean," Rex said. "Don't let his nerves do the tuning." Brian stood against the idea of showing fear the way you'd avoid an exposed wire. He tried to steady himself. He thought of James at the kitchen table, of a hand resting on his shoulder, of a sentence that ended with a promise. He thought of the scrap of leather in his tool roll, the notch in his wrench, small things that showed he'd belonged to someone.
He breathed and tried again. When the engine caught this time, it didn't just cough. It settled into a rhythm that had been asleep for decades, a deep staccato heartbeat, the push and pull of metal and fire. The sound filled the garage and moved through the people like a wave. Tools were set down almost reverently. Millie let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Rex's face cracked like a mask. The old barn of his expression softened. The engine ran long enough to warm the oil, to make the carburetor sing in a way that meant combustion was happening cleanly. Brian's eyes shimmered, and he didn't try to hide it. He had done it. They had done it. For a moment, everyone in the room knew what it meant to fight for a thing and find it. There was cheering, but not the kind that felt loudest in accounts made for spectacle. It was low and true, short claps and a few whoops, an arm around a shoulder. The bike's roar dampened into idle, and Butcher lifted Brian's chin with a thumb. "You earned the night," he said. "You did the work. Now we see what the paper says." Millie, with the pragmatism that had guided her since she'd been that same woman's girl, filed the emergency kinship paperwork. She walked a social worker through the garage, pointing out safety measures, neighbor references, and the schedule they'd set for Brian. The social worker was thorough, measuring the cot space, checking contact numbers, making sure there were adults on the roster who could take responsibility. There were questions about schooling and healthcare. Rex gave firm answers. A member could escort Brian to school. Someone had an extra enrollment form. They'd get the clinic the boy needed to enroll.
Temporary, Millie reminded Brian later, taking his hands in a way that was more comforting than conclusive. No promises, kid, but you did something that matters. You showed up. We'll give them a file. The file didn't move the way Hearts did. It moved in its own small, grinding bureaucracy. But the documents were in. Millie left with a promise to follow through and a cautionary smile that had affection tucked behind it. Don't get comfortable, she warned, not unkindly. This isn't a forever yet. It's an opening. Days slipped but didn't fully belong to Brian yet. He was allowed to sleep in the back bay under the watch of Rex and the others. The cot was hard and the heater sputtered, but it was shelter. He ate with the club, drank coffee that was perhaps one step shy of being hazardous, and mended schedules with the other boys and men who came through. People showed up with odd jobs, and Brian learned to count the currency of being useful, the nod of someone who'd trusted you with a socket, the way someone would slide you a spare jacket if a rainstorm cut into your bones.
Time moved forward, and with it the small stabilizing things. A health check at the clinic, a school counselor who met with Brian, a makeshift tutoring session with Diesel on algebra problems that mapped oddly to gear ratios. The social worker came back, looked around, and said she'd recommend provisional placement to the judge, noting the adults present in the structure they'd made. Millie sent an email with attachments. The judge's office asked for a hearing, which could spell months of legalese and waiting. The case wasn't closed, and no one portrayed it otherwise. 18 months later, Brian was not the same boy who had stood in the rain with a photograph and a deadline. He was taller. The edges to his face hardened into a kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can handle bad days. He had a job at Thunder Forks, his name on the ledger, and a key that felt small in his pocket and enormous in meaning. He visited James at the VA every Wednesday, carrying a thermos and the stories of the garage. They talk about torque and life in the same sentence, and James would smile at Brian's explanations, like a man hearing his hands speak through another voice. When James's heart finally gave out, slowly, as if the body had been making apologies for too long, the garage held a funeral that felt more like home than church. Men from a dozen towns came, wearing patched jackets and bringing folded flags, stories folded into their pockets. Millie stood near the back, her face taut but present. Rex read something he had written about second chances. Butcher played a piece of music on a battered harmonica that made the air feel like it could hold grief without cracking. After the service, they brought James back to Thunder Forks. They put his helmet on the shelf above the workbench, polished like an honored relic. They opened the bike's tool roll and slid a new leather patch into it that read, not as an entitlement, but as a verdict earned. Earned, not given. They pinned a strip of it inside the garage where anyone who needed a place could see it. Brian stood by the bike, fingers tracing the leather notch in his wrench. He thought about all the small choices that had led to that night in the rain. He remembered the cold and the bargaining, and the way Rex had tested him with a sentence that could have been cruel but turned out to be a challenge. He thought of Millie, who had been a bureaucrat and a guardian at the same time, and of Butcher, who had taught hands to listen. He felt the weight and the warmth of belonging, and it wasn't loud. It was close, like a hand on his shoulder. The legal outcome had been a tangle of hearings and recommendations, and finally a kind of compromise that mirrored the lives involved. Temporary placement that, because the adults had kept their end of the bargain, led to guardianship review and eventual extended care under the supervision of the club, with Millie as the caseworker still in oversight. It wasn't a clean line with a neat bow. It was papers and appointments and the slow building of trust. It was sometimes frustrating and sometimes monumental. No one promised it would always be easy. No one pretended the system was simple. But it was possible because they had chosen to show up organized and honest. Years later, the place where Brian had slept became an office with a second-hand desk and photos on the wall. James in a leather jacket, Rex with a grin, Butcher with his harmonica. The Shovelhead was no longer just an engine that had sputtered back to life. It was something that had stitched a family into a community. They framed the leather patch above the bench, and above it they put the photograph of James with Rex, still smiling and still telling a story. Underneath, in Rex's handwriting, someone had scrawled, "Keep the light on." In the quiet moments, Brian would stand and listen to the bikes coming down the lane, the growl of engines, the laughter, the clinking of parts being set down for another day. He kept the tool roll near him, the notch in the wrench worn down a little every year. It wasn't only about repairs. It was about finishing things that were started in bad times and left incomplete. It was about handing a learned craft to someone who needed a way back in. There were evenings, though, when he would stand where the garage smelled of oil and rain,
and remember that first night under the corrugated metal when he had simply asked to be kept. The question had been raw, nearly a survival plea. The answer had been a test, and in time, a home. Not everything in the story was neat. There were weeks when papers required meetings, and the judge wanted proof of schooling and stability. There were nights when Brian woke up in a cot and wondered if he had done enough. But each time those doubts came, the support was there. A call from Millie reminding him of an appointment, Butcher teaching him a tricky valve geometry trick, Rex ensuring a roster that would always have someone on duty. Being kept wasn't a single act. It was a series of repeated, reliable gestures. When the garage put up a small plaque to James, it was placed near the bench where the shovelhead had been reborn. A patch sat in a frame beneath the plaque with 2 words that had been said often around the shop: earned, not given. People who came in and read it understood that the phrase wasn't a slogan. It was a ledger, a record of the nights spent sweating over something that mattered to someone else, finishing what had been started. In the end, the boy who had come in the rain had grown into a man who could teach others how to listen to a chain and how to patch a broken life, not by promises, but by showing up. He worked with kids who had nowhere else to go, letting them sweep and hand him tools while he told them what top dead center felt like when you found it.
When a young kid from the shelter came with the same slouched shoulders and a photo in his hand, Brian didn't ask for miracles. He asked for truth. He gave them a roll of tools and a chance to be steady. Standing at the bench one afternoon, Brian picked up the framed patch and held it for a long time. He thought of the 48 hours that had changed him and all the small decisions stacked behind them. He thought of James and his quiet, flawed courage. He thought of Rex's way of being stern and kind. He thought of Millie's clipboard and law, of Butcher's harmonica, and the ways repair could be a sort of prayer. He looked at the patch and at a man who once had nowhere to stay and felt the oddness of belonging, but it could be both the result of luck and the product of work. He placed the patch back on the wall and set his hands to the bench, ready for the next thing that needed fixing. What would you risk to belong? If this story moved you, subscribe to follow more journeys like Brian's.